You're listening to the Retire Coast podcast, where money, business, and lifestyle come together. Join us each week as we explore smarter financial planning, starting and growing businesses, and building the life you want at every stage, from millennials and Gen X to today's retirees.
Welcome back to another episode of the 250th anniversary celebration for the signing of the Declaration of Independence that Retire Coast is pleased to present. This is one of many podcasts and a number of articles that we have written on retirecoast.com regarding the American Revolution and things that most people don't know, aren't discussed in school, and we bring to your attention because they are fascinating and they're part of our heritage. So today we're going to talk about the hidden business of the American Revolution. We know a lot about the battles and the famous people such as George Washington. What we know very little about or taught about at all in school is the business side, or how the revolution was financed and how it was made to work. Actually, when a good portion of the population was off fighting, there were still people who had to make sure that there was food, there were goods, weapons to be made, those kinds of things. And it's a fascinating story by itself. Reminded me a little bit about the industrialization of the United States during World War II, how the men were over fighting in Germany and over in Japan and the islands, and that was all in the news. But what was not in the news were the women and the people that stayed behind in order to make all of the goods that were required. Now, it's a bit of a stretch to compare both, but it's somewhat similar, actually. And we're going to present this to you in a dialogue format here so that you can hear two people talking about it and going back and forth with arguments and pulling things out of the article that aren't necessarily written there, but if you add two and two together, you get four, and they're going to talk about that fourth thing. So please stay tuned for that. Don't forget to go to retirecoast.com, where you can read about this in an extensive article we have that has a lot of visuals in it. It has some other audio things in it. It'll have a YouTube video as well, and you can learn even more about this topic. And, of course, it's attached to many other topics we have in there, such as weapons that were made during the war, which is a very popular podcast and article for us, and many other things, such as the camp followers, the women and children that followed the camps as they went along. So if you're really interested in the American Revolution, I hope that this is just one step along the way. Listen to our other podcasts and articles, and I'll see you at the other end. Thank you.
You know, when you picture the American Revolution, a very specific set of images probably comes to mind.
Yeah, it's almost cinematic, really.
Right, exactly. We've all seen the oil paintings, you know.
Yeah.
You picture these stoic generals sitting on these majestic, well-groomed horses. Mm-hmm. You hear the rousing political speeches echoing through grand halls in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And you envision the dramatic battlefield smoke clearing to reveal a new nation.
And everyone is wearing perfectly tailored uniforms.
Yes. It's very neat, heroic, highly curated image. I mean, the one we've all been digesting since grade school.
It's the highlight reel, and, well, it's understandable why we focus on it.
Sure.
We look at the muskets, the declarations, and the famous signatures because they're tangible, they're dramatic, and they fit perfectly into a tidy, triumphant historical narrative. We like history that happens in grand, sweeping strokes.
But today, we are going to completely dismantle that cinematic image in this deep dive.
We really are.
Because we're looking at the actual grimy, exhausting, microscopic backbone of the revolution. We're trading in the generals on horses for splintered, muddy wagon wheels.
Yeah, a lot of mud.
So much mud. We're swapping the rousing, beautifully penned speeches for frantically scribbled, completely disorganized accounting ledgers, and we are replacing the battlefield glory with the sheer, terrifying reality of colonial financial ruin.
Which is wild to think about.
We are going straight into the trenches of the 1776 supply chain, and you, the listener, are coming with us.
Which, if you really look at the mechanics of it, was just as dangerous and unpredictable as the battlefields themselves. I mean, the colonies were facing an unprecedented economic crisis, the scale of which is just hard to overstate. You had British blockades systematically choking off major ports.
Right, so nothing's getting in.
Nothing. You had trade routes that were practically non-existent or, incredibly volatile due to weather and war. And worst of all, you had an almost total lack of reliable currency.
Just a complete mess.
Exactly. The entire system was breaking down simultaneously. Without this hidden economy of ordinary workers, the merchants, the blacksmiths, the teamsters, the tavern owners, the military revolution would have literally starved in the fields within months.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're unpacking the hidden economy of 1776. And this whole exploration is powered by some incredible source material we've got our hands on.
Oh, it's fantastic material.
It really is. It's the Colonial Economy Simulator. It's this massive, fascinating educational ecosystem created by RetireCoast for America's 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial.
Right. And the brilliance of this source material is that it abandons the static history textbook approach entirely.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, it provides interactive historical tools that mathematically simulate what it was actually like to run a colonial business. We're looking at tavern profit ledgers, blacksmith production estimators, wagon freight calculators.
So detailed.
It is. It puts you directly into the shoes of an entrepreneur trying to keep a business alive during the economic chaos of the 1700s, using the actual data, prices, and logistical constraints of the era.
Okay, let's unpack this because the sheer scale of the colonial economic crisis is staggering when you really look at the numbers and the logistics.
It really is.
It wasn't just a political rebellion. I mean, it was an economic tightrope walk over a gaping chasm. And to really understand how they kept their balance, we have to start with the single most important survival tool a colonial business owner had. And no, it wasn't a musket.
Nope.
It wasn't a printing press. It was a book.
The handwritten accounting ledger. It was the absolute center of gravity for any colonial enterprise.
I want to spend a minute exploring the contrast between how we run businesses today versus how they did it in 1776, because the gap is just astronomical.
Oh, it's barely even the same universe.
Right. If you run a company right now, you have cloud storage continuously backing up your files in multiple server farms across the globe. You have automated accounting software categorizing your expenses the second a credit card is swiped.
Everything is instant.
Exactly. You have digital inventory management systems that alert you when a specific screw is running low. And most importantly, if you make a mathematical error, you just hit backspace.
Yeah, the software catches your missing zero.
But in 1776...
In 1776, the concept of a safety net did not exist. I mean, there were no standard forms, there were no calculators. Every single transaction, every ounce of inventory moving in or out, every debt incurred, and every promise made depended entirely on manual handwritten ledgers.
Which just sounds exhausting.
Think about the physical act of this. These books were often maintained at the end of an exhausting 14-hour day of physical labor. You are sitting by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle using a sharpened goose quill,
Right.
And you're dipping it repeatedly into a pot of ink that might be freezing if it's winter.
That is just bleak. And what blows my mind is the sheer volume of variables they had to track. It wasn't a simple profit and loss statement.
Not even close. Our source material details exactly what these business owners were forced to record to stay afloat. They had to track raw inventory coming in from diverse sources, shifting daily wages for laborers.
Which were probably changing all the time.
Oh, constantly. Plus, massive military contracts that might take years to fulfill, individual customer debts, and incredibly complex barter exchanges.
Okay, wait, walk me through one of those barter exchanges. How complicated could it actually get? Because in my head, barter is just I give you a chicken, you give me a loaf of bread.
Yeah, it was far more convoluted because of the currency crisis. Let's say you are a merchant selling a barrel of flour. The customer buying it doesn't have hard currency.
Okay.
So they pay you a quarter of the price in Spanish silver, which you literally have to weigh because people shave the edges off the coins to steal the silver.
Wait, literally weigh them?
Yeah, literally weigh them. Another quarter is paid in a promissory note from a local farmer, essentially an IOU.
Okay, so that's two forms of payment.
Right. Another quarter is paid in raw tobacco credits. And the final quarter is paid in physical goods, like a stack of raw wool.
You've got to be kidding me.
As the merchant, you have to calculate the exchange rate of all four of those completely different payment methods on the fly. You have to assess the quality of the wool, gauge the trustworthiness of the farmer's IOU, and then accurately document that entire chaotic transaction in your ledger before the ink dries.
I am so hung up on the liability of that promissory note. If I take an IOU from a local farmer as payment, what happens if that farmer marches off with the Continental Army and gets killed at Saratoga?
Yeah.
Does that note just evaporate? Who eats that cost?
You do. The merchant eats the cost.
Wow.
The debt becomes completely worthless, which means you just sold a quarter of your barrel of flour for absolutely nothing. You take the loss, and if you take too many of those losses, well, you can't pay your own suppliers.
Which brings up a specific pushback I have. In the modern era, we keep meticulous financial records, primarily because we are terrified of tax compliance.
Right, the IRS.
Yeah, we use QuickBooks because we don't want to get audited and hit with massive fines.
Yeah.
But in 1776, these people were literally fighting a war over taxation. They were actively rebelling against imperial revenue collection. So if there's no centralized IRS breathing down their necks, why be so obsessively meticulous about the paperwork? Why not just wing it?
It's a very logical question, and the source material addresses this tension directly through the perspective of Bill Anderson,
The creator of the simulator.
Yes, the business and real estate expert who engineered this whole ecosystem. He points out a fundamental difference in motivation. Modern businesses report to the IRS to avoid administrative penalties. Colonial businesses tracked every single penny out of pure, unadulterated survival.
So it wasn't about compliance at all. It was about preventing total ruin.
Exactly. We have to understand how brutal the 18th century legal structure regarding debt was. There were no LLCs. There was no limited liability corporate shield to protect your personal assets if your business failed.
Oh, man, so you're fully exposed.
Completely. If a colonial merchant made a ledger error, say, forgetting to collect on a series of debts or miscalculating the cost of freight, and the business went underfound, the creditors didn't just take the business.
What did they take?
Bankruptcy meant losing your actual home. It meant losing your land, your livestock, your family's personal possessions. You could be dragged into debtor's prison.
Just for a math mistake.
Yes. You could be ruined entirely and permanently simply because you failed to carry a 1 in a column of numbers.
That is terrifying. And the stakes weren't just isolated to that one merchant's family either. I mean, the ripple effects of a single ledger error could directly sabotage the war effort.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a colonial supply merchant miscalculating his inventory. A crucial shipment of gunpowder is documented as being in the warehouse, but due to a math error, it was actually traded away 3 weeks ago.
Right.
Suddenly, a local militia unit marches out to face a British regiment. They open their supply crates, and they're just empty.
Or consider the payroll ledgers. If an exhausted quartermaster messes up the payroll ledger and loses track of who has been compensated, you have soldiers who are going unpaid for months.
Yeah, and they're already suffering.
They're freezing, they're starving, and now they feel they're being robbed by their own commanders. That is the exact recipe for a mutiny.
Wow.
The Continental Army faced several severe mutinies, and they were almost entirely driven by logistical and financial failures, not a lack of patriotism. The ledger was the fragile thread holding the local economy and the entire revolutionary military effort together.
So if these incredibly complex, high-stakes ledgers were literally the difference between life, death, and total generational ruin, who was actually writing them?
Well, that's the thing.
How did these people learn to do this? Because it's not like they were logging on to an Ivy League business school to take a module on double-entry bookkeeping in volatile wartime economies.
No, formal business schooling, as we understand it, was practically non-existent for the average tradesman. A few very wealthy merchant families might have hired private tutors for their sons to learn mathematics and accounting.
Sure, the elites.
Right. But the vast majority of the people running the taverns, the forges, the mills, and the merchant shops had to learn through an entirely different system. Basic reading and math skills varied wildly from town to town. You had to learn through the school of hard knocks.
Which means the apprenticeship system.
Precisely. It was an entirely hands-on, deeply immersive system. A young apprentice, usually around 10 to 12 years old, would be legally bound to work in a shop or a warehouse.
10 years old.
Yeah, very young. And they didn't start by forging iron or pouring ale. They started with the books. They spent years just meticulously copying their master's ledger entries. They were essentially human photocopiers.
Wait, walk me through that. They are just blindly copying numbers. How does that teach them to actually run a business?
Well, because they aren't just copying numbers in a vacuum, they are physically observing the transaction, then recording it. They learn to calculate freight costs, not by reading a textbook on logistics, but by actually walking outside, looking at the muddy wagons, counting the horses, and talking to the exhausted teamsters.
Ah, I see.
They manage supply records by physically carrying the sacks of grain and counting the nails. They learned the math by touching the inventory.
Does this mean the earliest American economy was basically built on a giant completely decentralized, uncoordinated internship program?
What's fascinating here is that, essentially, yes. But we have to remember it was an internship program with life-altering stakes.
Right, because of the debtors' prisons.
Exactly. If the apprentice messed up the master's ledger, the master might lose his business, and the apprentice would be out on the street. This highly practical, deeply embedded education system ended up breeding a uniquely adaptable class of entrepreneurs.
They didn't learn abstract economic theory.
No, they learned ground-level economic survival.
They were learning how to pivot in real time.
Exactly. When a British blockade suddenly cut off the supply of imported sugar, they knew how to adjust the ledger to account for local maple syrup or honey because they had seen their masters pivot during previous shortages.
Oh.
They understood the physical relationship between materials, time, and money. They were capable of surviving the chaos of war because resilience and adaptability were baked into their education from the very first day they picked up a quill.
Okay, so you've got a highly trained apprentice who knows how to balance a complex ledger. The math is perfect. The inventory is counted. You know exactly what you have in the warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
But paper doesn't move physical goods. You can balance your ledger all night long, but none of that matters if you can't actually get your sacks of flour or your crates of muskets from your shop to the militia camp 30 miles away.
And that was a huge problem.
Which brings us to the physical reality of moving things in 1776.
Which can be summarized by a single miserable element.
Mud. So much mud. I dug deeply into the Colonial Wagon Freight Estimator tool from the simulator, and the variables it forces you to confront completely shattered any modern illusions I had about travel.
We live in a world defined by asphalt, concrete, and GPS routing. In 1776, a road was essentially just a narrow, deeply rutted dirt path cleared through a forest.
If you could even call it a road.
Exactly. They were incredibly poorly maintained, if they were maintained at all. Moving heavy freight was a logistical nightmare that bordered on the impossible during certain seasons.
The simulator doesn't just ask for the distance from point A to point B. That's the easy part. It forces you to calculate the physical degradation of the journey.
Yeah, it gets really granular.
It really does. You have to account for the specific capacity of the Conestoga wagon. You have to calculate the number of draft horses required based on the payload weight. You have to factor in the brutal terrain. Is it mountainous? Are there unbridged rivers to ford? Then you have to pay the daily labor costs for the teamsters driving the wagon. And looming over all of this is the weather.
The weather was the ultimate wild card. A heavy, multi-day rainstorm could turn a dirt road into an impassable swamp. A modern-day 2-hour drive down the interstate covers roughly 130 miles.
Okay.
In 1776, moving a heavy freight wagon 130 miles in perfect conditions might take a week.
A week?
In muddy conditions, it might take a month, or the wagon might sink to its axles and just get abandoned entirely.
I am trying to wrap my head around the physics of it. If you are a colonial merchant and you need to send a ton of iron goods to a neighboring state, how do you calculate the profitability of that trip?
It's extremely difficult.
Because the horses pulling the wagon need to eat every day.
Mm-hmm.
If the trip takes 3 weeks because of the mud, do the horses consume so many oats that the payload isn't even profitable anymore?
That is the exact mathematical trap that the wagon freight estimator simulates. The longer the journey, the more provisions the wagon has to carry just to sustain its own crew and animals.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Every bushel of oats you pack for the horses is a bushel of profitable cargo you cannot carry. And that is assuming everything goes perfectly.
Which it never did.
No. Wagons were constantly breaking down. The wooden axles snapped under the immense strain. Iron rims shattered on hidden rocks in the deep ruts. Horses became exhausted, lamed, or injured.
And we're talking about an active war zone. So it's not just the mud and the broken axles.
No, you also have to factor in the very high probability of human interference. You have the threat of banditry. You have loyalist militias who might sabotage the route.
Right.
Or you might run into a friendly Continental Army regiment that is freezing and starving, and they simply commandeer your entire wagon of supplies in the name of the revolution.
Just take it.
Just take it. You might get a promissory note in return, but as we discussed, that might be worthless.
This highlights such a profound strategic vulnerability for the revolution. We constantly read about the Continental Army suffering soldiers without shoes, men freezing without blankets at Valley Forge, regiments running out of ammunition during critical battles.
Yep.
And the tragic part of reading this simulator data is realizing that sometimes those supplies actually existed. They were manufactured, they were paid for, they just couldn't get there.
It's heartbreaking, really.
They were stuck on a wagon, sunk up to its axles in mud, 30 miles away from the men who were bleeding and dying for lack of them.
When your entire supply chain relies on horse-drawn wooden wagons navigating swamps and unpaved, deeply rutted roads, every single item you transport becomes exponentially more expensive, slower to arrive, and highly vulnerable to loss. The friction of distance was immense.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because moving things was so incredibly difficult, slow, and expensive, it triggered a massive macroeconomic consequence.
It changed everything.
Colonists simply couldn't afford to rely on imports from other colonies for their daily survival, let alone from Europe once the British naval blockades took effect. They were forced by the sheer terror of logistics to manufacture locally.
Necessity dictated the structure of the economy. If you lived in a town in Massachusetts and you needed iron nails to build a barn or flour to bake bread for the winter, you couldn't rely on ordering it from a centralized manufacturing hub 3 states away in Pennsylvania.
Because of the mud and the costs.
Right. The freight costs would bankrupt you, and it might not arrive for months.
So you needed your own local mill. You needed your own local blacksmith hammering out those nails. You needed your own local merchant sourcing whatever raw materials they could find nearby.
Exactly.
The terrible roads and the mud essentially forced the colonies to become fiercely self-sufficient on a micro level, community by community.
And because that long-distance travel was so agonizingly slow, exhausting, and dangerous, the physical spaces where these weary travelers, teamsters, and merchants finally stopped to rest became absolutely vital infrastructure.
They had to stop somewhere.
You can't sleep in a swamp, you need a safe harbor. These stopping points evolved into the most important economic, social, and political hubs in the entire colonial network.
We are, of course, talking about the Colonial Tavern.
Yes, and we need to immediately shatter the modern myth of what a colonial tavern was. Pop culture paints them as these quaint, dimly lit pubs where guys in tricorn hats sat around drinking ale, smoking clay pipes, and singing sea shanties.
That's totally the image. But looking at the Colonial Tavern profit ledger tool from the simulator completely rewires your understanding.
It really does.
So if I'm reading the data right, a Colonial Tavern was basically a combined hotel, post office, local restaurant, co-working space, courthouse, and military base, all managed by one highly stressed-out entrepreneur.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy. Taverns were the undisputed epicenter of colonial life. Yes, they were restaurants and inns providing calories and beds, but they served functions far beyond hospitality.
Like what?
They were the primary meeting halls where local magistrates and town councils would literally convene to pass laws. They were the central recruiting stations for the local militia.
I read that they were also the main communication hubs.
Absolutely. They were the 18th century internet. If you wanted news from the next town over or news from the war front, you went to the tavern.
It's where all the information flowed.
You listened to the gossip of incoming travelers. You read the printed broadsides and newspapers that the tavern keeper formally posted on the walls. They were the physical spaces where merchants negotiated their freight contracts, where farmers sold their surplus, and crucially, where political organizers spread revolutionary ideas away from the eyes of British officials.
But looking at the pure economics of running 110, it sounds like an absolute nightmare. Walk me through the tavern profit ledger simulation, because it looks like you are constantly hemorrhaging money while trying to balance unmanageable variables.
The tension is severe. The simulator forces you to balance your basic revenue streams, charging for food, a spot in a bed, and ale against brutal wartime realities.
Right.
First, you are dealing with extreme, unpredictable supply shortages. How do you run a restaurant when a blockade means you haven't received a shipment of flour or salt in 2 months?
You just don't have the ingredients.
You have to improvise meals with whatever local game or root vegetables you can forage or buy locally.
And what about spoilage? They didn't have commercial refrigeration.
Exactly. Spoilage was a massive financial drain. If you brew a large batch of ale or butcher a hog expecting a busy week of travelers and a massive rainstorm washes out the roads, nobody shows up.
Oh, man.
Your ale goes sour, your meat rots, and you take a massive loss on the ledger. Add to that the exorbitant wartime taxes imposed by local assemblies, the high cost of paying labor to keep the fires burning and the stables clean, and the profit margins become razor thin.
And then on top of all those normal business headaches, The militia shows up.
Right. It's a Tuesday night, you are already low on supplies, and suddenly 50 hungry, thirsty, freezing soldiers arrive at your door. Or a Continental Army officer arrives demanding lodging for his staff.
I am genuinely curious about how that interaction plays out. As the tavern owner, you have to house them, right? But are they paying you in hard currency?
Often they're not. They might offer you continental paper dollars, which we know were wildly depreciating.
Right. Or the officer might simply write you a quartermaster's receipt, a promise that the Continental Congress will eventually reimburse you for the food and lodging you just provided.
But you still have to pay your own suppliers for that food. How did these tavern owners manage that psychological and financial tension? On one hand, you are a patriot.
Right. You want to help.
You want to support the cause. You know these men are fighting for your freedom. On the other hand, you have a family to feed, and accepting useless paper money or empty IOUs will bankrupt your business and leave your own children homeless.
It was a brutal, agonizing balancing act. And this is a point the source material really illuminates. This is where we see that the ordinary workers, the tradesmen, the innkeepers, they were making massive existential economic sacrifices for the cause of independence.
It wasn't just the soldiers. No, it wasn't just the soldiers risking their lives taking musket fire on the battlefield. It was the local tavern owner risking complete generational financial ruin to ensure those soldiers had a warm hearth, a dry bed, and a hot meal before they marched. The economic sacrifice of the civilian population was the foundational bedrock of the military success.
But if you have a tavern full of militia waiting out a storm, they aren't just drinking ale and sleeping. They are a fighting force. Their gear is breaking. Their wagons need repair. The locks on their muskets need adjusting. The tavern owner can feed them, but keeping them armed requires a completely different skill set. Which brings us to the heavy industry of 1776.
When we say heavy industry in the context of the late 18th century, we are primarily talking about the ironworks, the forges, the blacksmith.
And once again, the simulator completely shatters a modern assumption I had.
Wow.
Whenever I hear colonial blacksmith, I picture a solitary guy with massive forearms, wearing a thick leather apron, standing in a cute little wooden shop by a dirt road, leisurely tapping away at a glowing horseshoe on an anvil.
A quaint, artisanal, solitary trade.
Exactly. Like something you see at a living history museum. But the Colonial Blacksmith Production Estimator and the Musket Production Cost Tool tell a wildly different, aggressively industrial story.
Yes, they do.
Blacksmiths were the absolute, undisputed linchpin of the physical economy. Yes, they made horseshoes, which were vital, but they also made the massive iron axles and structural hardware for the freight wagons we were just talking about.
They made everything.
They made the iron tires that prevented the wooden wheels from shattering. They made the thousands of nails required to build the barns, the heavy iron hinges for the warehouse doors, the plows to turn the soil, and most critically, the military hardware.
The sheer scale and complexity of this operation is what's truly astounding. Producing weapons and military-grade supplies was not a solitary artisanal endeavor.
It was a factory.
It required a massive, coordinated, deeply dangerous industrial effort. Let's walk through the actual mechanics of it. To forge iron, and specifically to produce the high-quality barrels and complex firing mechanisms of muskets, you needed staggering amounts of raw materials and energy.
Let's break down that energy cost, because you can't just plug an anvil into a wall socket.
Exactly. First, you need thousands of pounds of raw iron ore, which has to be mined and transported. But to smelt and work that iron, you need intense, sustained heat. You cannot achieve that heat with simple firewood.
Right.
You need charcoal.
And making charcoal is a massive undertaking on its own, right?
It is an entire sub-industry. You need an unbelievable volume of dense hardwood oak, hickory. Teams of laborers have to chop down forests, transport the timber, and then carefully stack and slowly burn it under mounds of earth for days or weeks in a low-oxygen environment to convert it into charcoal.
That sounds intense.
It's highly skilled, dangerous work.
So the logistics of just getting the charcoal to the forge is a whole separate supply chain nightmare before the blacksmith even touches a hammer.
Correct. And then, to get the fires hot enough to melt iron, you need massive bursts of air. A human being pumping a hand bellows isn't enough for industrial-scale ironworks.
You need something bigger.
So you need to locate your forge on a fast-moving river. You have to construct a dam and a water wheel to harness the hydrological power, which is then used to drive massive mechanical bellows and giant automated trip hammers that weigh hundreds of pounds.
This sounds like a 19th century factory, not a colonial workshop. The source material mentions a specific example that really blew my mind. James Hunter's Rappahannock Forge in Virginia.
Yes. The Rappahannock Forge is a perfect illustration of the true scale of colonial heavy industry. This was not a small, quaint shop.
It was huge.
It was a massive industrial complex sprawling along the river. They employed hundreds of specialized workers, smelters, strikers, finishers, carpenters, teamsters. It became one of the most vital military suppliers for the Continental Army, churning out muskets, bayonets, camp kettles, and tools.
Imagine trying to mentally manage that operation. Just close your eyes and put yourself in James Hunter's shoes. You are managing hundreds of diverse workers who need to be paid and fed. You are coordinating the sourcing of tons of iron ore and charcoal. You are relying on those muddy, broken down, impassable wagon routes to get your raw materials in and your finished, incredibly heavy iron weapons out.
Under terrible conditions.
And you are doing all of this while an active war is raging, while inflation is making your money worthless, and while the British Navy is blockading the coastline. The sheer administrative, mathematical, and logistical genius required to keep a place like Rappahannock Forge operational is staggering.
And we must factor in the existential physical risk. These massive ironworks were huge, stationary targets.
They couldn't exactly hide them.
The British High Command knew exactly how critical these forges were. It's simple military logic. If you can locate and burn down the forge, you stop the supply of muskets. You stop the production of wagon hardware, which paralyzes their logistics. You stop the production of horseshoes, which cripples their cavalry. You effectively grind the entire rebel army to a halt without fighting a single battle.
So the people running these forges and the hundreds of workers inside them were operating under the constant, terrifying threat of a British cavalry raid sweeping in and burning their entire livelihood to the ground.
They were actively participating in high treason industrial production. It was incredibly brave.
But here's the thing about a revolution. You can forge all the muskets in Virginia. You can stockpile all the gunpowder. But winning the physical war means nothing if you can't win the ideological war.
That's true.
If you don't have a way to communicate where those muskets need to go or why the local farmers should pick them up and risk their lives in the first place, the physical weapons are useless. To win the hearts and minds of the colonists, you needed a completely different kind of machinery.
You needed the printing press.
The Information War of 1776. We explored the colonial printer's ink and ledger calculator in the simulation, and I have to say, the printing business was not for the faint of heart. It might have been even more stressful than running a tavern.
Without question. Printers were manufacturing the literal lifeblood of the Revolution's communication network. They weren't just printing books for scholars.
Right.
They were producing the daily operating software of the society, local newspapers, official military mobilization notices, ideological pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, fiery political broadsides to stick on tavern walls, and the complex legal documents required to run local governments.
They were the glue holding it together.
As the source material explicitly notes, without the printers, revolutionary ideas would have spread at a glacial, word-of-mouth pace, and organizing a unified rebellion across 13 diverse colonies would have been impossible.
But the cost of doing this, the economics of running a print shop were brutal. And again, we hit the blockade issue. The simulator forces you to look at the supply chain of a printer. Let's walk through it. What did Colonial Printer actually need to physically operate?
The requirements were highly specialized and almost entirely dependent on imports. First, you needed a heavy, precision-engineered wooden and iron printing press, usually imported from Europe.
Okay, so that's the machine itself.
You needed the lead type. Thousands of tiny individual letters that had to be meticulously hand-set by skilled labor, backward, for every single page printed. You needed highly specialized oil-based ink, and most importantly, you needed high-quality paper.
And where did the paper come from? Because they weren't chopping down pine trees and mashing them into pulp like we do today?
No, 18th century paper was made from linen and cotton rags. It was a laborious process of collecting massive amounts of old textiles, breaking them down in mills, and pressing them into sheets.
That sounds incredibly tedious.
It was expensive and slow. And when the British Navy blockaded the ports, the import of high-quality paper, specialized ink, and replacement lead type completely stopped.
The scarcity must have been terrifying for a business owner whose entire model relies on output.
It was. Printers were frantically scrambling. They were begging the public to donate their old, rotting clothes to be mashed into paper. They were improvising dangerous chemical recipes to create local ink.
Oh, wow.
The material costs skyrocketed while the quality plummeted.
But even with the soaring financial costs, that wasn't the biggest risk, was it? I want to do a thought experiment here. Imagine you own a modern retail business today. You're stressed about your inventory, your global supply chain is a mess, your commercial rent is too high.
Normal business stuff.
Right. Now, imagine that simply putting your specific product in your front window could literally prompt the government to send heavily armed soldiers to burn your shop to the ground. That is the actual daily reality these colonial printers faced.
The political risk was immense, perhaps higher than in any other profession. A blacksmith making a horseshoe can claim he's just doing his job. A printer publishing a document declaring independence from the crown is committing undeniable, documented treason.
There's no hiding it.
Printing revolutionary propaganda, or even just printing factual news that the local loyalist militias or British authorities didn't like, invited direct, violent retaliation.
Your printing press, which, as we established, was an incredibly expensive, imported, and practically irreplaceable piece of capital equipment, could be smashed to splinters in 5 minutes by an angry loyalist mob or a British patrol.
And your lead type, your most valuable asset, would be melted down into musket balls to be fired at your friends. And yet, despite the crippling supply costs and the looming threat of the gallows, they kept setting the type.
They just kept going.
They kept pulling the lever on the press. Because they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the constant flow of information and ideology was just as vital to survival as the flow of gunpowder.
So we have this massive interconnected ecosystem. The printer is risking his life to publish the broadside. The blacksmith is working 18-hour days to forge the musket barrels. The tavern owner is draining her savings to feed the passing militia.
Everyone is putting it all on the line.
At the end of the day, all of these people expected to be compensated. They needed to feed their own families. But here is where the entire system almost collapsed entirely. In 1776, the very concept of money, the mathematical language used to exchange value, was fundamentally broken.
It was a state of absolute dizzying financial chaos.
We dove into the 1776 currency equivalent calculator and the colonial payroll ledger tools. And looking at the math, I honestly don't know how anyone managed to buy a loaf of bread, let alone calculate payroll for a massive forge.
It's hard to even comprehend.
Let's start with the most basic problem. There was no single standard currency across the colonies.
To understand the madness, imagine walking into a modern grocery store today. The person in line in front of you pays for their groceries using a crisp U.S. $100 bill.
Okay, normal.
The next person pays using a handful of Mexican pesos. The third person offers the cashier a gold pocket watch. And the fourth person just writes a note on a napkin saying, "I'll give you 50 pounds of tobacco next month," and hands it to the cashier.
And the cashier has to happily accept all of it, instantly calculate the shifting daily exchange rates for all those items in their head, and make change.
Exactly. The colonists were constantly juggling a bizarre mix of currencies. They used British pounds, shillings, and pence. They used Spanish silver pieces of 8, which they frequently hacked into physical pieces to make smaller change.
That's where the phrase 2 bits comes from.
Yes, exactly. They used newly printed continental dollars. They used literal warehouse tobacco receipts as cash in places like Virginia. They used personal promissory notes. And when all else failed, they use straight-up physical barter.
And that confusing web of multiple currencies is just the baseline problem. To make matters infinitely worse, you inject catastrophic hyperinflation into the system.
Let's explain why that happened. Because it wasn't an accident.
No, it was a desperate fiscal policy. To fund the massive, unprecedented costs of raising and supplying an army, the newly formed Continental Congress did what governments almost always do when they are backed into a corner in a crisis. They turned on the printing presses.
They printed so much of it.
They started printing massive amounts of paper money.
The famous continental dollar.
Right. But there was a fatal flaw. They didn't have the gold or silver reserves in a vault anywhere to back up the value of that paper. And because they printed so much of it so fast, the market rapidly realized the paper was essentially unsecured debt.
Confidence plummeted.
And as confidence drops, the purchasing power of the currency collapses.
Hence the famous historical phrase, "Not worth a continental."
Exactly. The depreciation curve was staggering. A paper dollar that could buy a sack of flour in January might only buy a single loaf of bread by December. The paper money essentially became worthless.
It's devastating.
So you have this cascading economic freeze. Merchants are terrified to accept paper money for their hard goods. Farmers refuse to sell their crops to the army because they don't want to be paid in paper that will be worthless by the time they get home.
Right.
Prices for basic goods skyrocket because everyone is hoarding hard currency. Actual gold or silver, which is incredibly scarce due to the British blockades.
Let's put this into a practical scenario. Think about the nightmare of managing payroll under these hyperinflationary conditions. The Colonial Payroll Ledger tool really hammers this specific pain point home.
Oh, the payroll had to be a nightmare.
Let's say you are James Hunter running the Rappahannock Forge. You have 50 exhausted, soot-covered men working in your forge. It's Friday evening. It's time to pay them for their week of bone-crushing labor.
Okay.
How do you actually execute payroll when the paper continental dollars in your lockbox might lose half their purchasing power over the weekend? If you hand a worker a stack of paper money and he knows he can't use it to buy firewood to keep his children warm, what happens?
He drops his hammer and walks out. Or, worse, the entire workforce riots and burns the forge down. You cannot sustain heavy industry on a worthless currency.
So what is the solution? How do you prevent the riot?
This is where we see the incredible improvisation of the colonial entrepreneur. The source material details how business owners had to completely reinvent the concept of payroll and compensation just to keep the local economy from seizing up completely. If decentralized paper money was useless, you bypassed it entirely. You paid your workers in physical, usable goods.
You essentially reverted to a sophisticated, hyper-localized barter economy just to keep the gears turning?
Precisely. If you ran a grist mill, you paid your workers by giving them a percentage of the flour they milled, which they could then bake or trade themselves.
That makes sense.
If you ran a forge, you provided on-site housing, daily meals, and firewood as the primary bulk of their wages. You extended them direct credit at the local general store, guaranteeing their purchases with your own physical inventory.
It was an absolute survival mechanism. The macro financial instability was everywhere, raining down from the Continental Congress and the British blockades.
Yeah.
But the microeconomy, the ordinary workers, the tradesmen, the laborers, they adapted. They bypassed the broken system. They found creative, highly localized ways to transact actual value when the abstract currency completely failed them.
Which perfectly transitions us to the ultimate lasting legacy of this entire grueling era. We've talked about the mud, the ledgers, the ruined currency, and the isolated taverns. All of this profound financial instability, this physical isolation caused by terrible infrastructure, the blockade cutting them off from the comfort of European imports, it forced the colonies into a corner.
The very tight corner.
And in fighting their way out of that corner, they sparked a robust economic independence that perfectly mirrored their political goals.
It was the crucible that birthed American entrepreneurship.
Exactly. Because they were so physically and economically vulnerable to British blockades, communities quickly realized they couldn't just sit around reading old ledgers and waiting for cargo ships that were never coming. They had to aggressively expand their own local manufacturing base.
The revolution, despite all its destructive chaos, acted as an incredible high-pressure accelerator for early American industrial development. We saw massive, rapid expansions in domestic iron production, as we discussed with the forges.
We had to make our own stuff.
We saw the rapid growth of local textiles, women mobilizing to spin and weave their own homespun cloth to replace the boycotted or blockaded British wool. And particularly, we saw a massive surge in local shipbuilding.
Because if the most powerful navy in the world is blockading your coastline, you need to build faster, smaller, locally designed merchant vessels to slip through the net, and your own privateer vessels to fight back.
It is the realization of the economy of independence. The colonists, particularly the business class, realized a profound truth. You cannot be truly politically free if you remain entirely economically dependent on the very empire you are fighting.
It's impossible.
Political declarations on parchment are meaningless if you rely on the enemy for your shoes, your nails, and your gunpowder.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, looking closely at the Colonial Economy Simulator, it is striking how intensely modern this all feels. The technology is vastly different, obviously. We aren't worried about the axle of a Conestoga wagon snapping in the mud.
No, we have different problems.
But the core pressures haven't really changed. Modern businesses face severe supply chain disruptions. Look at the massive economic ripple effects when a single cargo ship blocks a canal, or when a global pandemic shuts down overseas factories. We face the anxieties of inflation eroding purchasing power.
Very true.
We navigate unpredictable labor shortages, rising transportation and freight costs, and the sudden impacts of global political uncertainty.
The tools have evolved from goose quills to cloud computing, but the fundamental risks of operating an enterprise, the fragility of supply networks, and the constant threat of unforeseen variables are exactly the same.
So what does this all mean for us today? It means that the specific traits required to survive the hidden economy of 1776, the rapid adaptability, the relentless local problem solving, the willingness to take massive calculated risks, and that sheer stubborn resilience in the face of logistical nightmares, those aren't just historical footnotes.
No, they're foundational.
Those are the exact same traits that came to define American entrepreneurial culture. It's written into the economic DNA of the nation.
The political independence of 1776 is famous. It is what we celebrate with parades, fireworks, and statues. But what the data in the source material irrefutably proves is that the glorious political victory was entirely, completely dependent on an exhausting economic victory.
It was won behind the scenes.
And that economic victory was being fought and won every single day, inch by inch, in the meticulously balanced ledgers, in the crowded, tense taverns, and in the blistering heat of the local forges.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to take a second to recap the incredible journey we've been on today. We started with that cinematic, polished myth of the Revolution, the generals and the grand speeches, and we aggressively dug down into the dirt and the mud of reality.
We really got into the weeds.
We did. We found that behind every famous general sitting on a horse, and behind every glorious battlefield victory, there were thousands of unnamed blacksmiths working brutal 18-hour shifts. There were printers risking their lives and their livelihoods to set type. There were exhausted teamsters fighting through frozen swamps to deliver flour. And there were tavern owners staying up until 2 a.m., meticulously tracking their handwritten ledgers by fading candlelight, desperately trying to keep their families out of debtor's prison while keeping the dream of independence alive.
And we truly must acknowledge the incredible, painstaking work of the historical archives that preserve this hidden reality for us. The fragile ink-stained ledgers, the commercial journals, and the merchant receipts housed in the Library of Congress, the National Archives, Colonial Williamsburg, and Mount Vernon. These aren't just old pieces of paper.
They're treasure troves.
They're the actual receipts of the American Revolution. They provide the empirical data showing us exactly how deeply accounting, logistics, and local manufacturing shaped the trajectory of world history.
It is genuinely phenomenal to look at history through that lens. But before we sign off, I know you have a final thought, something for everyone listening to chew on as they go about their day, based on the physical, logistical realities we've unpacked.
I do. This exploration raises an important question, something that lingers in your mind long after you step away from the simulators and close the history books. We've clearly established that the political independence of 1776 is famous, but the raw source material shows us that true economic independence had to be won first. It had to be built block by block in local workshops, over muddy roads, by ordinary people who knew how to make things with their hands. So I want you to look around your own town today. Think about our profound modern reliance on instant, globalized shipping, digital banking, and centralized manufacturing.
It's everywhere.
If a massive, catastrophic supply chain collapse happened tomorrow, does your local community still possess the hidden physical skills, the practical logistical knowledge, and the raw entrepreneurial grit to rebuild its own local economy from the dirt up, just like the colonists did?
That is a brilliant, grounded question to leave us with. It forces you to look at your own neighborhood completely differently. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden economy of the American Revolution. And the next time you picture the events of 1776, don't just look at the flags and the muskets. Remember, the true history, the actual mechanics of survival, is always found in the ledgers.
I hope that you learned something and you enjoyed this topic today. Please come back to other podcasts and go to retirecoast.com, where you'll find a wealth of information on the Revolution and the 250th anniversary. Also many other articles that can help you in your life. Thanks for dropping in, and I hope to talk to you in the next one. Thank you.